Welcome to Microeconomics. In this video, I will review the story of markets, in particular, the market model of demand and supply. And we're going to review the different factors that affect demand and supply. Not quantity demanded, not quantity supplied, but demand and supply. Then we will review what happens when a change in the price of a commodity occurs in a market to demand, and what happens to supply when the price of a good changes. So in essence, let me share my whiteboard. And what I will go over are the factors that impact demand and supply and that cause it to shift. And the factors that impact supply, causing also shifts in supply. And the main factors that are in your chapter 3 are actually on this particular piece of board work. Preferences of consumers, of buyers, impact demand because as goods become more popular, their demand increases, as well as their quantity demanded, because the opportunity cost of items that are in greater demand because they become fashionable or they become culturally more acceptable, you increase demand, and as a consequence, quantity demanded also increases. As preferences for things also dwindle or diminish, you will see a shift in demand to the left rather than to the right. So we call preferential shifts directly related shifts to demand. When preferences favor a good, demand increases. When preferences make goods fall out of favor or out of fame or fortune or whatever, the demand for the good decreases. The number of buyers is also something that directly impacts demand. More buyers means more demand. Fewer buyers means fewer market participants. On the consumption side means lower demand. Income of consumers actually could have a positive or a negative effect on certain goods. If a good is what we call a normal good has a direct relationship to demand. As the income of consumers rises, we see the demand for normal goods increasing. We also have goods that are called inferior goods. And inferior goods actually, as their name would indicate, fall out of favor as income rises. And so inferior goods have an inverse relationship to demand. As income increases, inferior goods fall out of favor, their demand diminishes, hence the inverse relationship. And expectations can be tricky. If we expect or anticipate that a good will become scarce, its demand increases right now in anticipation of their future scarcity. And so our expectations can impact a good's demand directly in proportion to the risks embedded in consumption of a good. So more risks in the future, more demand in the present. Direct relationship. And then complements are things like peanut butter and jelly or salt and pepper, burgers and buns, hot dogs and buns, burgers and fries, electric cars and electric outlets in your home that the car can plug into. Those are called complement goods. And complement goods impact directly the demand for a product. If a complement becomes cheaper, then the demand for the cross product of a complement product becomes higher. So in effect, that would be an inverse relationship. Substitute goods are things that you consume in place of. And so substitute goods are have pricing that behaves in direct relation to the demand shifts that occur in a good. So any improvement in preferences, buyers, the incomes with normal goods, expectations and risks, and prices of substitutes will cause a shift to the right, whereas any decline in those variables or any movement of income going higher in inferior goods or the price of a complement going up will create shifts to the left. So shifts can be right or left, and direct and inverse impacts make the variable that is changing move in the same direction as the demand for the product that is our purpose of study or our object. On the other hand, when we look at supply, the factors that impact supply are technology. So more technological innovation usually results in greater supply of new goods and a substitution away from goods that become obsolete. So it could be positive when technological innovation improves the production process for a good. Or it could be negative in the case of a technological innovation that, or inverse relation with a technological innovation that creates obsolescence. So for example, the technological innovation of circuit boards created an obsolescence of typewriters, because now we do our typing in computers, in laptops, in tablets. We even talk to equipment, and equipment synthesizes speech into text. So in those situations, technology has made the supply of typewriters become obsolete. And so the supply has shifted to the left with improving technological factors. The number of producers is directly related to supply. More producers, more supply; fewer producers, less supply. The prices of inputs have an inverse relationship to the supply of a good. When it becomes more expensive to produce a good, the supply goes down, so it shifts to the left. When the prices of inputs falls, the supply becomes easier to produce, hence supply shifts to the right. Expectations can also play a dual role, but primarily the expectations about the future can impact the supply today. For example, if I foresee that that there's going to be an inordinately high risk of fires in California in the summer of 2020, if that's my expectation, then what I'm going to try and do before the summer of 2020 is supply more building materials and construction materials before the summer, in anticipation of greater demand during the summer. So I'm going to start milling wood in the winter and in the spring for summer sales. And the prices of related goods revolves around competing goods. So when competing goods become cheaper, supply declines. When competing goods become more expensive, supply expands. So that corresponds to a direct relationship. And complement goods will have the reverse effect. So those are the things that cause shifts to the right or to the left, that increase or decrease demand, that increase or decrease supply. depending on the factors going up or down. So that was chapter 3. That was the competitive market model introduced in chapter 3. Where we began our study of markets. Now, what we're going to be doing in the next chapter, in chapter 4, is we're going to be taking that particular story of markets, and we're going to try to quantify the impact of these factors as well as own price factor into what are called in chapter 4 elasticity measures. So what is elasticity? What does it refer to? And the simplest way to describe elasticity is elasticity refers to price or income sensitivity. Another way of thinking about it is how the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied, or I should say ore, of a commodity how sensitive quantity demanded or quantity supplied of a commodity are to, let's call them value factors. And those value factors are prices and income. And in particular, in chapter 4, the focus of study are the price elasticity of demand, the income elasticity of demand, the cross price elasticity of demand, and the price elasticity of supply, the factor price elasticity of supply. So those are the 5 main metrics that quantify these relationships that we qualified in chapter 3. So our job in chapter 3 was to take these different factors that impact supply and demand, and we learned in chapter 3 to qualify how demand and supply reacted to changes in these factors. Qualify being the key word, because we didn't say by how much these changed. We just talked about in what direction they changed. So we focused on right and left shifts of supply and demand. We are now going to, in chapter 4, we're going to now focus on quantifying, measuring amount, as opposed to direction. we're going to be quantifying as percent changes on demand and supply, the impact of factors that affect each respective demand and supply aspect. And so that's really the crux of this video. It's to introduce you to what we need to do in chapter 4 to complement the story that we reviewed, that began in chapter 3. So in chapter 3, we talked about markets. We talked about markets having a demand and a supply side. Each side of the market, buyers and sellers, react to various different factors that impact their decision on buying and selling, on demand and supply. And now we are going to quantify those effects in the form of percentage changes, in the form of elasticities, in the form of how sensitive demand and supply are to these value factors. So I hope this introductory video to chapter 4 and also this review video of chapter 3 enables you to connect the subject matters in these two chapters in preparation towards the first midterm, which is coming up real soon in a couple of weeks, which will talk about markets, it'll talk about elasticity, it'll talk about efficiency, it'll talk also about how government can sometimes enter markets and impact what goes on in markets, and we call that government intervention. In the scheme of your course, this is essentially the coverage of Carlin in chapters 1 through 6 that will be covered in that exam number 1. And now we see the individual components of this module, the individual components that make up the story. In chapter 3, we introduced the notion of markets. Now in chapter 4, we quantify market impacts of factors that affect how producers and consumers behave in these markets. So I hope this video was useful. I thank you for watching it, and I hope it brings you success in your completion of all your homeworks and quizzes and exam activities. Take care.